Good evening. I am Jenny Luca, CEO of the Children's Inn, and I'm honored to welcome you to a very special virtual event to celebrate our 30th anniversary, a candid conversation with Dr. Anthony Fauci and Dr. Christine Grady. But before we hear from our esteemed speakers and very special friends of the Inn, I want to take a moment to express my deep appreciation and gratitude to each of you. COVID-19 has presented the Inn's most difficult challenge in our 30-year history. However, our goal has remained consistent since 1990, to provide a safe and supportive environment for the seriously ill children, young adults, and their families who stay with us during their trips to the NIH. Your support has undeniably had a critical and positive impact on our ability to carry out our mission during the pandemic. Families have continued to travel to participate in NIH's groundbreaking research studies, which provide them with so much hope for their child's future. You have made it possible for us to keep our doors open for the families and medical partners who rely on us during this very difficult time. We've even been able to have a little bit of virtual fun and much needed distraction to ease minds and lift hearts at the end of these very tough days. On behalf of the Children's Inn, thank you. Tonight, you are going to be treated to a very special event where you will practically sit virtually in Tony and Christine's living room and have the opportunity to hear them have a conversation. During their conversation, they'll talk a little bit about their shared passion for science and public service, their thoughts on how the Children's Inn has supported clinical research at the NIH Clinical Center over the years, and especially pediatric AIDS research. And they will touch on the COVID-19 pandemic, which we know is top of mind for everyone right now. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Tim Conway, Executive Vice President and Group President of Public Sector at NTT Data, sponsor of this evening's program, and also a very special partner to the Children's Inn. Welcome, Tim, and thank you.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. NTT Data is honored to bring you a candid conversation with Dr. Anthony Fauci and Dr. Christine Grady. NTT Data is privileged and humbled to be included in the conversation with such esteemed guests. As a father, I know there's nothing more precious to me than my children. I can't imagine what it would be like to be a parent whose child needed to seek treatment at NIH. It's comforting to know that the Inn is here to support families during what is surely a difficult time. The commitment, research, healing, and hope that the Children's Inn gives to so many families is truly inspiring. I am grateful to NTT Data for sponsoring this virtual event. To me, it illustrates the art of the possible. What can be achieved when government, industry, and nonprofits join forces for the greater good? In these difficult times, working together to support something bigger than ourselves has become a pressing imperative for our country. Leadership, partnership, and perseverance are not only necessary, but essential as this deadly virus continues to threaten our collective resolve. As a company, NTT Data is committed to helping support the frontline response of our government. For many years, NTT Data has worked quietly behind the scenes, supporting the important work of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention and the National Institute of Health, to include Dr. Fauci's National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Across these agencies, NTT Data quickly shifted scientists and researchers to telework where possible and provided in-office support where required so that they can continue to deliver their mission of critical biomedical research worldwide. At NIAID, we played a critical role ensuring that the staff of NIAID had the physical infrastructure as well as the secure access to the critical applications required to develop and test therapeutics as well as a vaccine. We as a company value and trust that vital public health organizations have placed in us. We are truly honored to continue that support as we endeavor to help the nation weather this global pandemic. I know that our guests share this same commitment. Although our two guests require little introduction, I'd like to share with you some highlights of their commitment to public health and to the Children's Inn. Dr. Anthony Fauci has served as director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases since 1984. Dr. Christine Grady has been with the NIH Clinical Center since 1996, serving first as the Bioethics Deputy Director, and since 2012, she's been the Chief of Bioethics. The NIH Clinical Center is the largest hospital in the world dedicated entirely to clinical research. Both Dr. Fauci and Dr. Grady are great advocates for the Children's Inn. Dr. Grady serves on the Inn's board of directors, and Dr. Fauci has been a champion of the Inn in its services since inception. Please help me in welcoming them here this evening. Thank you to both of you for joining us tonight, Dr. Grady and Dr. Fauci. I think most of us on the call feel like we already know you. You've been a part of our extended family for many months, sharing information, insights, and ways to stay safe in these unprecedented times. But I know there's a lot more to the two of you than what we see on television. People may not know that you're married and that you met while consulting on a patient's case back in 1983. So let's start there. Please tell us a little bit more about how you met and how that meeting has set the stage for the work that you do together at the NIH.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you, Jenny, and everyone for being here tonight. It's really our pleasure to be here tonight, and it's my really special pleasure to serve on the board of the Children's Inn, something that I really appreciate doing, and to work with Jenny and her wonderful team on all of the great things that they do. It is true that Tony and I met a long time ago, 1983, over the bed of a patient. I was a clinical nurse specialist at the time, and there was a patient who had been there for a while who was from Brazil, and I had recently lived in Brazil, so I served as an interpreter. And that was the first time I met Tony. And that was in August or September of 1983, September 1983. And not much more than a year after that, we were married. So that's a long time ago. A lot has happened since then, but 35 plus years we've been married.
Love at first sight, over the bedside of a patient.
I think one of the things that's sort of characterizes our 35 plus years of marriage is joint working at the NIH, but commitment to the NIH. Both of us have worked at the NIH ever since we met in different roles and in different ways. And both of us have been committed, I think is the right way to say it, to public service, to science, and to the care of patients. I think, one of the questions that you asked us was, how do we balance that? How do we balance our professional lives and our personal lives? I think for me, I would say for myself, and I definitely know it's true for Tony, work can be all-consuming, but so is family. And we have the great fortune of having 3 wonderful children who grew up learning about the NIH and about the Children's Inn. They've all been there. They've all volunteered there. And we've been able to find ways to be partners in this endeavor that have worked for us. What do you think works about our partnership?
Well, I think it's just the mutual support. We both have been involved in the kind of work through the NIH that has been challenging in the sense of the urgency, namely in my own field, but Chris has lived through that with me, of pandemics. I mean, starting from when we first met, it was the old consumption of being involved with desperately ill patients who were living with HIV even before we knew it was HIV. And we've done that throughout the years up to the present day. I think that COVID-19 obviously dominates the global health scene, but we still have a very serious issue with global HIV and HIV in the United States. And then over the years, there have been things that have been the anthrax attacks, pandemic flu, Zika, Ebola, and now COVID-19. So it's been a very stressful situation uh, for me in the sense of what my responsibility has been as a scientist and as the leader of the Institute. And I don't think I could possibly have been able to get through that to this very day had it not been for Chris, who is just extraordinary in providing wisdom and counsel to me, knowing how to talk to me about things that nobody else can talk to me about when I'm pushing myself to the brink and I don't realize it. And she holds me back like, you got to get some sleep. You've got to drink some water. You've got to take care of yourself, because when you get involved in something as overwhelming and cataclysmic as a major global health crisis, unless you have somebody who really cares about you and understands you, it makes it very difficult. Whereas when you do have somebody who's there for you to give you absolute honest counsel and advice, I think that makes for a very special relationship, which I believe we have.
I think, one thing that's interesting, you asked about how we met. One of the things that I remember from the early days of working at the NIH is watching Tony on rounds, because there was a special something about him where he really cared about the patients in ways that stood out from other people that I observed. I'll give you one example. There was one patient way back early on who didn't have HIV. I'm going to talk about HIV in a minute, but he had been very ill and he was getting better. And we were on rounds, and the fellow who was presenting rounds said, his lab values were good and this was good, and sort of he's doing fine. And so Tony asked him, but can he walk to the end of the hall? And the fellow was kind of taken aback and said, I don't know. And so Tony said, well, until he can walk to the end of the hall, he's not doing fine. We need to do better. We need to get him to walk to the end of the hall. And that is just one story of, the kind of whole picture that Tony always has had with patients. So one of the things we did in the early years, as he's already said, is work together, actually, in some cases, with patients with HIV. And I know that Tony has made, he's famous for the things that he's done with HIV. Some of the things that I remember that drew me to that work and that were interesting things that we shared, actually, the patients that I had the privilege of taking care of were all very young people who had very vibrant in their lives, and then all of a sudden were stricken with this disease. And it occurred to me then, and I still think of them now, they could have been my brothers, my neighbors, my people I knew well, and they all were incredibly courageous in facing what was at the beginning completely unknown and very scary. And the kinds of things that we could do. I'm a nurse, so as a nurse we could offer some comfort and some care and sometimes interventions to help people in those dark days of HIV. But I also think, working at the NIH, we had the hopefulness that comes along with research and with understanding that what we were doing was trying to find ways to change that trajectory. And in fact, of course, that's what happened. And I'm going to have you say something about that, how HIV changed from the beginning when we first were taking care of patients who were so sick.
Well, it really has been a journey, an extraordinary journey. And if you look at what we all experience, Chris and I together, but also so many healthcare providers throughout the country and the world, our friends in New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles, was what I would refer to as the dark years of my professional career, and even in some respects spilling over into your own personal life. Because even though you had a loving partner like Chris to go in every single day, and as Chris said, deal with young, mostly gay men who you knew had been extremely vibrant and creative and enjoying life, to all of a sudden be stricken with a disease that you could do very little for except care for them. We didn't have interventions. We had no good drugs, and almost every one of our patients died. And what happened, and this is a phenomenal testimony to the extraordinary impact of science, of basic clinical applied science, which led to the development of combinations of drugs, which started off with a single drug in 1987 with AZT, double drugs throughout the late 80s and early 90s, and then the triple combination that was in 1996. So from 1981, when I first started doing it, and Chris joined me in 1983, to 1996, we really had a gradual improvement in what we could do with patients. But 1996 was a complete transformational year because it was the beginning of the era of combination antiretroviral therapy, which totally transformed the lives of people. And it's gotten better and better and better and better throughout the years with better drugs, less toxic drugs. Instead of drugs that you need to give 28 pills throughout the day, multiple times, where you could do one pill once in the morning, that now in 2021, the lives of HIV-infected individuals are approaching normal if you get someone early enough and put them on appropriate therapy and they stay on therapy. So it's been an extraordinary journey living through almost 40 years of the evolution of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, where it went from nothing but suffering and death to actually the miracle of science. And all of that took place in our world, in our sphere, even though the rest of the world was experiencing the advantages and the advances, much of which was NIH funded. We, Christine and I, were experiencing it in real time right at the NIH, including what we saw happen with the Children's Inn, where we had situations where it was terrible when Phil Pizzo was the main player back then with pediatric HIV/AIDS, but we were close partners in seeing how we went from children who just had a terrible prognosis to children now who are living into adolescence and adulthood now because of the major advances that we've seen. So it's been an extraordinary journey.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to think back about that time, because Phil Pizzo had a vision also of what a place where these children and their families could feel comfortable coming to the NIH and participating in research. And as Tony said, at the time, nobody expected those children to live very long, to tell you the truth. And now most of them are still alive and they're, thriving and they're adults. But Phil had this idea, and the community of people who were taking care of AIDS patients and who were studying HIV-related issues was small enough that we all knew each other pretty well. And I know that he worked really hard with a number of people to make the Children's Inn a reality. And it was his vision, plus the generosity of Merck and the gracious and tireless efforts of lots of congressional spouses who worked together to create what we now know as the Children's Inn. And in those days, for children with HIV and their families, it was a haven. I mean, it was incredible place that they could go and get away from the hospital and, be in, as we talk about it, a home away from home. It's also amazing to me as time has gone by. I mean, certainly most of those children are now adults. There are very, very few children that we ever see, young children with HIV anymore. But the Inn has continued to grow and extend that kind of home away from home to kids and kids with all kinds of diseases and their families. And watching the Children's Inn over the last 30 years, and I was there when the ribbon was cut, and I know Tony was too. So we have been watching it over the last 30 years. It's amazing to me, and it's a wonderful thing to watch that, how it's matured, how well oiled it is at taking care of children and their families, expanding the age categories of people that we take care of at the Children's Inn. I mean, there's so many wonderful things about the Children's Inn, and I see it in the faces of the children who go there and their families. I mean, when they walk in, they feel like we're home again. We're home in a way that being away from home and certainly in a hospital cannot provide. So it's really quite an extraordinary place. What would you say you learned from patients with HIV?
What did I learn from patients with HIV? Something you mentioned a few minutes ago, how an individual in the face of extraordinary personal adversity can still maintain their dignity and show extraordinary courage. So people would ask often, how could you possibly go through years of this darkness that I described a few minutes ago? But it wasn't really all darkness. It was darkness because we were trained to be healers, and we were not healing anyone because everyone was progressing. But what was the bright light that would often light up a room would be how extraordinary courageous that these individuals were during a very terrible period in their life.
I agree. I mean, the word that I would use also is courage. I mean, the kind of adversity that they were facing, not just illness, but stigma and people shunning them. And yet, even in their sickest moments, they often had not only a courage to face what they were facing, but a sense of humor and looking out for each other and looking out for us. I mean, the healthcare providers that were taking care of people with HIV, I think learned as much from them as they learned from us. And there was a camaraderie between the healthcare providers and the patients that was really remarkable and beautiful. I think we also learned, or I also learned, the power of research. That what research has been able to do, as Tony was describing before, in terms of changing the trajectory of HIV is remarkable, and it's a success story that should be told over and over again. And I mean, it's not over. We're still doing things in HIV. Lots of research is going on in HIV, but the treatment that is available that allows people to live almost normal lives is a remarkable success story. And then the other thing I would say I learned from HIV, and I mean, I learned it in other cases as well, but are the rewards and the challenges of being a healthcare professional. That you learn so much, and you learn so much about not only science and disease and health, but about resilience and about courage and about just the strength of human beings in so many ways. And there's challenges. I mean, one of the things that I would say, one thing we should talk about is how what we did and learned from HIV might be helping us now with COVID. I mean, I think one of the challenges in the early days of HIV was health, because we didn't know much about it. Healthcare providers were afraid. Everybody was afraid. People were afraid. They didn't know how it was transmitted. They didn't know how to avoid getting it. And certainly we've seen some of that same thing come true with COVID and with some of the other infections along the way. But I think I mentioned rewards and challenges for healthcare providers. I mean, fear is one thing, but one of the things I learned then and I've seen now is healthcare providers, despite being afraid sometimes, they're committed to what they do. And they will go above and beyond and take care of patients who need care, even under some pretty difficult circumstances. So that's one thing that I think is a lesson for bringing forward from HIV for COVID. What other things can you think of, other lessons from HIV?
Well, there are scientific lessons. One of the things that's a not very well appreciated story that I had the opportunity, like about 2 hours ago, to explain it to Vice President Harris, because she visited the NIH to get her booster shot for COVID. And we wanted to tell her a little bit about the NIH. And we introduced her to Barney Graham and Kizzmekia Corbett. And Barney Graham is the one who is the senior person, together with the junior person, Kizzmekia, to develop the Moderna mRNA vaccine. And one of the things that very few people appreciated, and she loved the story because she's very interested in science. Her mother was an NIH-funded investigator in cancer research, was a member of several NIH study sections. So that's another thing that people don't appreciate about Kamala Harris, is that her mother was an NIH grantee. How about that? Anyway, cool. It is pretty cool. Anyway, I explained to her that for the years in the Vaccine Research Center that investigators were trying to develop, albeit unsuccessfully thus far, a vaccine for HIV, the structural biologists, Peter Kwong, who were using cryo-electron microscopy to get the right conformation of the HIV trimer that would induce neutralizing antibodies. And it was understanding how you get a fixed conformation of a molecule. Barney Graham, who was interested in respiratory syncytial virus, was fascinated by the work that Peter Kwong was doing. They were doing different things and said, I'm working on respiratory syncytial virus. Maybe we could partner together and collaborate and see if we could take a look at the structural conformation of the F protein of respiratory syncytial virus and get it in the right conformation to be very immunogenic. And it was successful and was a major breakthrough in respiratory syncytial virus vaccinology. Then along came MERS, and he said, let's try to make a vaccine for the Middle East respiratory syndrome. And as he was working on that, it became clear that this technique of getting the molecule in exactly the conformation, which we learned it all from HIV research. Then when SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 came, Barney said, let's get that spike protein and do exactly what we did with RSV, exactly what we did with MERS, and literally the fastest in the history of vaccinology from the time we had a sequence of the virus, namely SARS-CoV-2, in January 10th of 2020, less than 1 year, 11 months, we had vaccine that was safe, 95% effective, and was already going into the arms of people. That is amazing that happened. And it was very related to the research that Peter Kwan and John Mascola and everybody else were doing 15, 20 years ago on HIV. So HIV has its intellectual tentacles out in helping other diseases.
It's also interesting. I mean, it's a great story of how the science builds and then happens to be ready at the right moment to create a thing like a COVID vaccine in such a short time. But two things that I think people wonder about, Tony, maybe you could address. One is, why don't we have an HIV vaccine then?
Well, the reason we don't have an HIV vaccine is that in order to get a vaccine, you have to have a proof of concept that the body is capable of making an adequate immune response against a particular pathogen. So it doesn't matter how serious the pathogen is, as long as the body is able to recognize it and make a good immune response. So take smallpox, polio, measles. Those are all very serious diseases that can maim and kill. Yet, the overwhelming majority of people who get those diseases make an immune response that clears the virus, gets them back to health, and prevents them from getting infected with the same pathogen. That's not the case with HIV. The body does not make a very good immune response against HIV. And that's the reason why, amazingly, of the 77 million people in the world who've been infected with HIV, there's not a single documented case of spontaneous, complete recovery where people clear the virus, because it doesn't make a good response against this particular pathogen. With coronavirus, as devastating it can be in some people, most of the people recover from SARS-CoV-2 and make a very good immune response. So as long as the body shows you that it can make a good response, we can make a vaccine that can actually induce that good response. And that's the reason why we have a vaccine for COVID-19, but we don't have a vaccine for HIV yet.
Yeah. So, another thing that people worry about with the COVID vaccine is the question of whether or not people who are protected with the COVID vaccine could still transmit virus. Could you say something about that for everybody? Because I think that's something people's not.
Yes, the primary endpoint of both the Pfizer trial and the Moderna trial that gave the 94 to 95% efficacy was whether or not the vaccine could prevent clinically symptomatic disease, mild disease. A secondary endpoint was whether it could prevent severe disease. So the one thing that we don't know yet is, does it protect against clinical disease, but not against infection? So that someone could get infected, but the vaccine prevents them from getting sick, but they still have virus in the nasopharynx. We're going to find out in the next couple of months whether that's true or not by doing serial sampling of nasopharyngeal of people who might get asymptomatically infected. However, since we don't know, we have to assume that even though you are vaccinated, that you might have gotten infected, even though you don't have any symptoms. And for that reason, you hear me and my colleagues saying, even though you're vaccinated, you should still wear a mask, still do physical distancing, and still avoid congregate settings. Not that you're going to get infected, but that you might infect someone else. And that's the reason why.
Yeah. It's interesting, too, that, a lot of people have worried that the pace at which this vaccine was created suggests that corners were cut or compromises were made. And this raises some ethical concern on some people's minds, but also some scientific concern. My understanding is that no corners were cut. What's your understanding about that?
No, corners were not cut. I think it's a very important question. I get asked that at least a couple of times a day. And the speed that I mentioned, this transformational, historic speed of doing something in months that normally would take years, was totally a reflection of the exquisite advances in the science of vaccine platform technology, where you can do things literally in months that would take years. And there was never any compromise of safety, nor was there any compromise of scientific integrity. It was merely taking advantage of these spectacular advances in science, in addition to investing hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to pre-buy vaccine and make it ready so that as soon as you show that the vaccine works, you have vaccine to distribute.
So do you think in the future, I mean, that last thing you said is really important because that may be a key ingredient for future vaccines too. But do you think in the future the scientific success that COVID vaccine has had will make it easier to make vaccines for other diseases?
Absolutely. In fact, right now, there was a lot of skepticism and maybe even criticism of our making the mRNA platform one of our primary platforms, because no one has ever made a successful vaccine that has been licensed using this brand new technology, which is the mRNA technology. However, it has gone beyond our expectations. So what we're already seeing now are people trying to use that platform technology for HIV, for malaria, for tuberculosis, and for certain cancers to do immune therapy for cancer.
That's great.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one of the things, my work is ethics, right? So one of the things that I've been focusing on in the last year are ethical issues that have been raised by COVID, which are numerous. There's tons of them. I'm just going to say something about the ones related to vaccines, because one of the issues early on was this question of, can you go fast without compromising? And certainly scientific compromise is worrisome, but so is ethical compromise. And so there was a lot of discussion about how to do vaccine trials as quickly as possible without making any compromises. And one of the things that's interesting to me is that, people separate, for example, the scientific challenges, the ethical challenges, and the practical challenges. I think vaccines are a great example of how you can't separate them. The science, you have to have good science, you have to have good ethics, and the practicalities are going to depend on both attention to scientific necessities and ethical necessities. And so it's really interesting to put them all together. And one of the things that's happening recently is the question of distribution of vaccines and rollout. And ethics has had a big role in this in the following way. I mean, despite the big investment that Tony was talking about in terms of buying doses, having them created ahead of time so they'd be ready to distribute once there was proof that the vaccine was safe and effective, there was still an anticipation that there wouldn't be enough vaccine to vaccinate everybody. And there isn't. I mean, this is a global pandemic. We have a reason for everybody to get vaccinated, and there just isn't enough vaccine for everybody yet. And so early on, or at least 6 months ago or so, ethicists got together and started to think about what are the values and goals that should guide allocation of vaccine when there isn't enough for everybody. And the value that consistently came across all the different groups that looked at this was something that they might have termed slightly differently, but it was basically maximizing benefit. How do you get the most benefit out of the vaccine? And thinking about that, the things that are so important and the way that the rollout has begun, we want, using that value of maximizing benefit, both to save lives and to preserve really important societal functions like healthcare to save lives of people who get sick. And so the first two priorities for almost every schema that was put together based on those values were healthcare providers and people in nursing homes or long-term care facilities and the staff in those facilities. And that's really where the vaccine rollout started. Almost every state did it that way. There were some diversions. But one of the things that quickly became apparent is that the practicalities of delivering vaccine led people to realize there's actually another really important value that I think everybody knew but wasn't put on the table as much, and that is we need to vaccinate, as many people as quickly as possible. And so people began to struggle with the priorities and make decisions based different kinds of decisions. So just one more thing about that. The kinds of decisions I'm talking about is, if you stick to a certain prioritization schema too rigidly, you might end up with doses of vaccine that you don't know what to do with. And it seems wrong ethically to not use them. And therefore, they should be offered to whoever you can find. At the other extreme is having no prioritization schema and just sort of opening it up, as first come, first serve, basically. And unfortunately, that disadvantages a lot of people. And so that's not a good schema either. And so something in the middle that uses the values and the goals, but recognizes the importance of using every single dose that is available. And, there's still some challenges ahead in terms of rolling out vaccine. I think one thing that we might learn is how to deliver vaccines better in the future, right?
Better learn that pretty quickly.
Yes. So one of the things that probably is obvious to many people is that given the attention that COVID has shown on Tony, it has impacted our personal lives. And I think, there's a lot of things to be thankful for and a lot that we have been able to, both of us have been able to do in terms of COVID epidemic to try to help. But there are a few things. So for example, despite the busyness that you have, the number of interviews, the number of demands on your time, the number of scientific responsibilities that you have, you take the time to talk to individuals and to groups that, others sort of say, why are you doing that? So, for example, recently there was a pediatric patient at the NIH and the Children's Inn who asked for you to speak to her. And you did. You took the time, and apparently she was thrilled by it. So why do you do that? Why do you make the time for individuals or groups that, high school students or other groups that...
Well, you do that because I never let go of my identity as a physician. I still see patients in the clinical center, not as intensively as I used to back when you and I first met because of other responsibilities, but I have a very strong connection to the individual, even though I'm dealing at a global level and at a domestic level in large numbers of patients and impact of what we do. You still can't forget that there's individual people involved. And that's the reason why, in order to reground myself frequently in the reality of what we're doing, when that patient, who was a patient on the Cancer Institute ward, because I was famous to that person was a child and wanted to get a chance to meet me. So I figured, heck, if there's something I want to do today that's worthwhile, this is one of them. So I went over there, and it was just gratifying. It was wonderful for the child and the child's mother, but it was just as good for me to see the big smile in the patient's face and see how excited the mother was to see me. So it was a plus plus. It was all around plus. It was plus for me and plus for the family. But I do that. I do that. I think frequently, because I do, even though I'm very, very, very busy, I think you always have to have time for individual people. Otherwise, you just become so dissociated from what the real world is that you forget, and you can't forget, because there are individual people out there who just a visit, a hello, a smile can really make their day.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I mean, it's what I was saying before about rewards and challenges. I mean, I think we get very busy and it's hard to find time to do things, but there are certain things that are really important. And as Tony just said, his identity as a physician and seeing patients and making a difference in patients' lives and getting it back from the patient. And I feel a lot that way with respect to my work with the Children's Inn. It's a privilege for me to be a member of the board, because I am really totally sold on the mission of the Children's Inn and the way that it offers such a wonderful, comforting place for children and their families when they're going through some pretty devastating stuff in their lives. And there's just no place better. I mean, the feeling that you get when you walk into the inn, but also the programming and the staff and just everything that the inn does is really fantastic. I think one of the things that I love actually is the phrase that the Children's Inn uses on their logo and on their website, where the power of childhood meets the power of research. And for me, that is sort of what drives me. I mean, it's the power of research that keeps me at the NIH for all these many, many years. It's the power of childhood that makes me so attached to the Children's Inn and what the Children's Inn is about. And it's the power of being able to be part of working with people at times in their lives when things are very difficult, but they're making a difference, to help them make a difference that I learned from that. So it's really a wonderful combination of things for me. I think, it also, Tony and I have also both spent a lot of time talking to young people. And there's young people who might be interested in science or research or clinical activities. And I think, from my perspective, and I want to hear your perspective too, anybody who's interested in science as a child and wants to do something that feels like they're helping other people, research is a great way to do that. And clinical research even better, because you get to have both sides of that in your daily life. So it's a wonderful way to spend your life doing research. I don't know what would you tell young people about?
Well, science in general and biomedical science is not for everyone. But if in fact you have the slightest inclination of pursuing that, I can tell any young person who's listening, that is potentially the most exciting thing you could possibly do, because it's discovery, and discovery of the unknown is so gratifying, but also you're helping people, which is, I think, the bottom line of it all.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I mean, as many people know, this year there have been socks and bobbleheads and all kinds of things made about Tony. I don't think that's what drives him at all. And in fact, it's more a distraction than much of anything else. I mean, it's really it's the rewards of what we're doing that really matter. So last question, what are you looking forward to in 2021?
I'm looking forward to putting an end to this pandemic as we know it. I don't think we're going to eradicate it. I don't think we're going to eliminate it. But I think with the proper implementation of the vaccine, I think that by the end of this year, if we're lucky and we handle the mutants in a way that responds well to them, that we could start to approach some degree of normality as we get towards the end of 2021. And then I'm looking forward, when that happens, to seeing our 3 daughters in real life.
What I'm looking forward to is hugging our 3 daughters and hugging the kids at the Children's Inn and the staff and everybody that I haven't been able to hug in way too long. So thank you for listening to us. Tim, are we back to you?
I think we are. So first off, on behalf of everybody in attendance, I'd like to thank you both, Dr. Grady and Dr. Fauci, for taking the time out of your schedule to meet with us tonight. Your journey at NIH has been remarkable, and the fact that you were able to literally marry your personal and professional lives together is inspirational, but it's also really made a difference in the lives of many. The other thing you talked about tonight, which is something that I kind of, I guess I know, but you kind of said it in a way that it strengthened it, but the power and the strength of marriage, or really any committed relationship, kind of fuels our strength and our confidence that we have in ourselves, right? That you have somebody there that supports you and kind of gives you that level of confidence to be maybe greater than you believed you could be. And I think that is kind of a power of a relationship. I can certainly speak for myself, and I think those on the call, that your leadership during the time of crisis, and again here tonight, has been kind of a comfort to us all. It was fascinating to learn the lessons that you learned through previous pandemics like AIDS and SARS that provided the research foundation to accelerate this vaccine and hopefully get us back to a kind of a position of normalcy. And I think I can speak certainly in my role in technology and our industry, and really our nation. We want to help, right? We all want to be a part of the solution. We all want to see our kids go back to school, whether it be, elementary school, high school, college, and be educated. And we want to have those family relationships again that we missed this year. I mean, whether it be Thanksgiving or, the holidays here at the end of the year, it kind of left us with a hole. So, I guess if I had one last question, and I look at the kind of the new reports of a new strain of virus that may be out there, and the importance of kind of collaboration among health-focused agencies in the U.S. and abroad, maybe you can speak to, what you see for the role of information technology today, but I guess a little bit more than that. I mean, you talked about clinical and applied science and the importance of that, but if we take clinical and applied science and couple that with information technology and things like artificial intelligence, how can that accelerate, in the future, both the discovery, the treatment, and the care of allergy and infectious diseases?
Well, it's actually absolutely critical when you're dealing with a global pandemic that is, by definition, global. It's a pandemic. Every country is involved. Information needs to be exchanged in real time, particularly when you have something like you alluded to, where you have the development of mutants as the virus changes. You have to have databases, genomic surveillance, ready access in real time to data so we can respond in real time by knowing what the challenge is and modifying our approach, even if that means upgrading a vaccine or developing new diagnostics. So the information exchange of something that emerges in South Africa, we know sooner or later is going to get to where we are, or emerges in the UK, we know it's already here, the mutant. But if we didn't have the good information technology available, we would never be able to address that as quickly and as effectively as we have.
It's also, I mean, I think it's definitely an incredible asset to science, information technology, but it's also an asset that we have utilized in so many ways during this pandemic. Just to give you two examples, the network of healthcare providers around the country who have been able to exchange information about how to take care of patients. As we were learning day to day the differences and the changes that the people needed to know, and sharing that through information technology was vital to the kind of work that people were doing. Ethicists were sharing information all the time. I mean, like constantly, about crisis standards of care and about setting priorities and different things that people really were struggling with. And I mean, everybody knows, without the kind of information technology that we now have, we're all getting used to using, we wouldn't be able to do this. We wouldn't be able to, kids wouldn't be able to go to school. We wouldn't be able to have all the meetings that we've had in the last 10 months or so. So information technology is vital to science, but it's vital to life. And the life that we now learn is, lessons for the future about how we're going to use it in different ways going forward.
Thank you. And I think it'll only increase the importance of your role of, as we put all this information together, kind of the ethical side of that, right? Which is, how do we use information for good and use it for ethical means, as opposed to, I'll say, nefarious activities.
Sure. And that's going to be a challenge. It is a challenge already, and it's going to be a challenge in the future.
Yep. Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Tony and Christine. What a special evening. Thank you for inviting us into your home. Thank you for being so candid and open and transparent. We are so grateful for your leadership now more than ever. And Tim, thank you and your team at NTT Data for supporting this special event and the Inn, as always. And of course, thank you to our supporters who are listening tonight for being with us for the past 30 years. We look forward to your continued commitment and more events like this. One day, hopefully getting back to having events in person. But thank you all who helped this event happen tonight. And we will see you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to be with you.
Thank you, Jenny.